August 17, 1943. The skies above the New Guinea jungle were a contested arena, a deadly chessboard where every move meant life or death. On that morning, a young American pilot climbed into his cockpit, his stomach a knot of cold fear. He was flying out to face a superior number of enemy fighters, a scenario that had become a death sentence for so many of his friends. But this mission was different. Hidden inside his aircraft was a secret single, illegal modification made by a desperate mechanic in the dead of night. It was a fix that broke every rule in the manual, a gamble that could end in a court-martial or a fiery crash. But if it worked, it would change everything. At the makeshift, muddy airfield of WWII, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of avgas. Staff Sergeant Ray Gable stood silently, a shadow under the massive left wing of the P-38 Lightning. He watched his assigned pilot, Lieutenant Jack Foster, perform his pre-flight check. Foster was just 22, with a boyish face that looked out of place against the backdrop of war. He had flown 7 combat missions. 7 times he had engaged the enemy. 7 times he had returned with empty gun chambers and a growing sense of dread. Intelligence had come in at dawn. A large formation of Japanese A-6M0 fighters was patrolling the northern sector. Foster's squadron was being sent to intercept. Gable had been a crew chief with the 5th Air Force for 11 months. In that time, he had come to know the P-38 not as a machine, but as a living, breathing entity with its own personality and its own fatal quirks. It was a magnificent beast with Allison engines, a central nutshell for the pilot, and to long-tail booms that gave it a sinister, insect-like profile. It was faster than anything the Japanese had in a straight line, especially at high altitude. Pilots called it the fork-tailed devil, but Gable knew its secret heart, and he knew it was broken. In the brutal, close-quarters knife fight of a dogfight, it was a lumbering giant. The enemy's weapon, the Mitsubishi A-6M0, was its perfect opposite. Constructed with a ruthless focus on lightness and agility, it could turn inside a circle with a radius so tight it seemed to defy physics. It could complete a full 360-degree horizontal turn in the time it took the heavier, more powerful P-38 to struggle through 180 degrees. In aerial combat, the difference wasn't a statistic, it was the gap between the trigger and the target, between going home and going down. U.S. Fighter doctrine was born from this stark reality. The orders were clear, repeated in every briefing: never, under any circumstances, try to outturn a zero. Use your speed advantage. Climb to altitude, dive like a falcon, fire a burst, and use your momentum to climb back to safety. It was a hit-and-run game. Foster had studied this doctrine. He believed in it, and in the chaotic reality of the South Pacific skies, it had failed him utterly. The Zeros were not just agile, they were flown by veteran pilots who understood American tactics. They would use their climb rate to get above the Lightnings, then bait them. They'd present a tempting target, lure a P-38 into a committed turn, and then exploit that fatal delay in roll response. They would cut inside the Lightning's wider turning arc, slide onto its tail, and that was that. A short burst of cannon fire, a bloom of flame, and another name was stricken from the roster. In the 6 weeks prior, Foster's group alone had lost over 30 P-38s. The official after-action reports, typed up by intelligence officers far from the front, consistently cited the same cause: pilot error, failure to follow doctrine. But Gable, with grease under his nails and the sounds of dying engines in his ears, knew that was a lie. The problem wasn't the man in the cockpit. The P-38's aileron controls, the surfaces that roll the aircraft, were operated by long steel cables. These cables ran from the pilot's control stick, through a complex labyrinth of pulleys inside the long tail booms, all the way out to the wings. Over such a great distance, and by design, the system had a minute amount of slack. A tiny bit of play, maybe 3/8 of an inch at the control yoke. On paper, in the comm environment of a Lockheed factory in Burbank, this was within acceptable engineering tolerance. But at 250 miles per hour, with a zero filling your windscreen and your life depending on an instantaneous response, that fraction of an inch was an eternity. It created a lag A dead zone between the pilot's instinctual jerk on the stick and the wing's actual movement. Gable had felt it himself during maintenance. He'd reported his concerns to the squadron engineering officer. The response was a dismissive wave. The cable tension was within specifications. Modifying flight control systems was a court-martial offense. Only the factory had the authority to authorize such a change. The factory was 7,000 miles away and pilots were dying today. So, on the evening of August 16th, with the tropical darkness pressing in and the generators humming, Ray Gable made a choice. He was done watching. In the quiet of the maintenance hangar, illuminated by a single, swaying work light, he pulled a length of high-tensile piano wire from his toolbox. It was salvaged from a wrecked P-38 that had crash-landed the week before. Using a pair of needle-nose pliers, his hands steady despite the risk, he bent the stiff wire into a crude, narrow U-shape. It was a makeshift tensioner. For 8 agonizing minutes, he worked inside the cramped, dark cavity of Lieutenant Foster's left tail boom. The space was tight, the edges sharp. He nicked his finger, and a smear of blood darkened the wire. His heart hammered against his ribs. The sound of a jeep outside might be the MP's. Finally, he installed the device, linking it into the aileron cable assembly. It added mere ounces of tension. It pulled that fatal slack out of the system. He tested it with his hand. The response was immediate, crisp and silent. He closed the inspection panel, cleaned his tools and said nothing. At dawn, he stood on the flight line and watched Foster's P-38, now fundamentally different from every other aircraft on the field, roar down the strip and vanish into the morning haze, heading for its rendezvous with 18 zeros. The fate of one man, and perhaps many more, now hinged on 6 inches of stolen wire. Gable's resolve was hardened by memory. He remembered Lieutenant Carl Miller, a quiet pilot from Ohio. Miller's plane had returned from a patrol just 3 weeks earlier, its tail section shredded by 20mm cannon fire. Miller had been pale but alive, speaking in a confused, frustrated monotone about a zero that had read his mind. He'd tried to brake left, then hard right, but his aircraft felt sluggish, unresponsive. The enemy's bullets, Gable noted as he patched the holes, were clustered in a perfect, tight pattern. That was the mark of a masterful deflection shot. The Zero pilot had led his aim perfectly, anticipating exactly where Miller's plane would be a split second in the future. Miller shouldn't have been there if his aircraft had responded instantly. 2 weeks later, flying a different, unmodified Lightning, Carl Miller was killed over a ball. The report, again, said pilot error. Then there was Captain John Ace Reed, a squadron legend with 9 confirmed kills. Reed knew the P-38's limits better than any pilot in the theater. On August 3rd, his flight was jumped by zeros over the Solomon Sea. Radio transcripts later revealed his final, confused transmission. "My controls are mushy. They're not responding." His wingman, watching in horror, said Reed's aircraft seemed to stall in mid-roll, hesitating for a critical moment before following his command. That moment of hesitation was all the Zero needed. The official finding was a tragic case of pilot error, likely due to combat fatigue. But Gable and the other ground crew, who had tuned Reed's plane to perfection, didn't believe it. They shared glances, spoke in low tones, but were powerless against the official record. By mid-August, the mess hall had too many empty seats. Every pilot who returned from a scrape told a similar story: of faint lag, a feeling of flying through thick air, a momentary resistance before the plane obeyed. Most chalked it up to the nature of their heavy fighter. It was a trade-off for speed and firepower. But Gable had developed a diagnostic test. During his cable tension checks, he would pluck the steel lines like a guitar string. They were in spec, but they were wrong. The evidence was in the sound and in the growing list of the dead. So what is the duty of a soldier when he knows a secret that is getting men killed, and the very rulebook designed to protect them is the instrument of their doom? The night before the mission, Lieutenant Foster had found Gable in the maintenance bay. The young pilot's bravado was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. "Sergeant," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is there anything you can do?" He was asking for a miracle, for a fighting chance. Gable had looked at him, this kid who should have been back in Iowa working harvest, and made a promise. The hangar was a cathedral of shadows. The only sounds the buzz of jungle insects and the distant rumble of a generator. The piano wire was stubborn, fighting the pliers. The cramped interior of the P-38's boom was a metal jungle, snagging his coveralls, scraping his skin. When the tiny clevis pin slipped from his grease-slick fingers, it fell into the darkness with a faint, mocking tink. Failure meant Foster's death and likely his own disgrace. When the pin was finally secured and he pulled the cable, the result was transformative. The slack was gone. The connection between human will and machine response was now direct, unmediated, pure. Foster picked a target at the edge of the formation, his gun-sight pipper settling on the red Hinomaru. He fired a burst. The Zero pilot, a veteran, reacted instantly with a snap roll to the right and a diving turn. On every previous mission, this was the moment Foster would feel it, that sickening, lagging sensation as his heavier plane began its slow, reluctant roll to follow, giving the enemy time to escape. But this time, there was nothing. No lag. This time the rounds connected, walking up the Zero's fuselage. A flash of flame, a puff of black smoke, and the enemy fighter spun away. His wingman's voice crackled in his headset. Bandits. High at 6 o'clock. To more Zeros, having seen their comrade fall, were diving on him with murderous intent. Every fiber of his training, every line of the doctrine, screamed at him to shove the throttles forward and run, to use his speed to escape. But in that crystal-clear moment, Foster understood the doctrine was built for a broken airplane. He had a fixed one. Instead of running, he did the unthinkable. He reefed the control stick hard back and to the left, executing a savage, high-G reversing turn directly into his attackers. The lightning whirled around with an agility that stole his breath. The lead Zero pilot, committing to his diving attack, had not anticipated this. He tried to adjust, but it was too late. Foster was now inside his turn, the Zero filling his windscreen. A short, close-range burst was all it took. In less than 60 seconds, Jack Foster had done what was considered tactically suicidal. He had outturned 3 of the world's finest turn fighters and scored 2 confirmed kills. Back on the ground at WWII, the shaking in Foster's hands was so violent he could barely unclip his oxygen mask. He climbed down from the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with cold sweat. He found Gable standing apart from the celebrating ground crew. From high above, Captain Frank Royce, a respected flight leader, had witnessed the entire duel through his canopy. He had seen Foster's P-38 perform maneuvers that defied the known laws of physics, governing the lightning. Royce was a pragmatist. He didn't believe in miracles, he believed in mechanics. He found Gable later that day. "Sergeant," he said, cutting through any pretense, "what in God's name did you do to Lieutenant Foster's airplane?" Gable, knowing the jig was up, confessed everything. Royce listened, nodded, and issued his own order. "Do it to mine." Not with a memo from headquarters, but with a whispered conversation between a sergeant and a captain. That night, Gable modified Royce's plane, then his entire flight. A quiet, underground network was born, spreading from pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic, across the battered airfields of New Guinea. It was a conspiracy of survival, enacted with 6 inches of wire and 8 minutes of forbidden labor. The mechanics became artists of deception, installing the tensioners before missions and carefully removing them before official inspections. The results were undeniable. The kill-to-loss ratio, once a grim 2-to-1 in favor of the Zero, began to level, then tip. Pilots who had been merely surviving began fighting with aggressive confidence. They could now reverse a disadvantage, could now risk a turning fight and live. The psychological impact was profound, but it was no longer just on the Americans. The Japanese noticed first. Veteran Zero pilots, aces with dozens of kills, began filing confused. Frustrated reports. The American fork-tailed devils were behaving differently. They were rolling into turns faster, reversing direction with shocking abruptness. Tactical sequences that had been reliably fatal for months were now failing. The Zero's greatest strength, its supernatural agility, was being neutralized by something the Japanese couldn't see or understand. They examined wreckage of downed P-38s but found no new gadgets, no secret weapons. The modification was invisible, hidden in the cable runs. Looking for all the world like original equipment, the uncertainty bred caution. The hunter's confidence was shattered. By October, intercepted Japanese communications revealed new standing orders. Avoid engaging P-38 formations, unless possessing a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. The technological tide of the Pacific Air War had turned on a tiny, illegal piece of wire. The modification was never officially sanctioned during the conflict. Later, a Lockheed engineering team, investigating field reports of improved handling, discovered the makeshift tensioners. They tested the concept, validated its safety and effectiveness, and formally incorporated a refined version into later production models. Ray Gable's name appears in no patent, no official report, no citation for merit. He finished his tour, mustered out of the service, and returned to California, where he opened a small, unassuming garage. He rarely spoke of the war. Jack Foster survived his tour, returned to Iowa, raised a family, and for decades, without fail, he called Ray Gable every August 17th. The two men were bound by a secret that had saved one life and, historians later estimated, the lives of nearly 100 other pilots who benefited from the spreading fix. This is how real innovation often happens in the crucible of war, not in the quiet halls of a corporate design bureau, waiting for committee approval and triplicate forms. It happens in the mud and the blood, in the desperate ingenuity of those who face the problem at its sharpest point. It is born from the courage to see clearly, to act decisively, and to bear the responsibility of breaking the rules for a higher purpose. The story of the P-38's piano wire is a testament to the unsung heroes, the sergeants, the mechanics, the craftsmen who, with grease on their hands and a profound sense of duty in their hearts, quietly changed the course of history. If you found this story of hidden courage and desperate innovation compelling, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps Winds of Thought share more of these forgotten, pivotal chapters with you. Our channel is dedicated to unearthing the tales that slipped between the pages of the history books. Subscribe and hit the bell to join our growing community. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you joining us from today? Drop a comment below and say hello.